So I think firstly, I guess it's important to flag that Colombia is already on the right path. For example, as I mentioned before, is already seen as a leader in the uptake of things like electric buses. So it's important to acknowledge that as well. I think in general, for all governments, it's really important to have strategic thinking at the heart of government within the energy transition.
En este episodio tendremos a Matteo Craglia. Matteo trabaja en el Foro Internacional de Transporte. Es quien lidera los temas en materia de bajas emisiones de carbono, tecnologías alternativas como nuevos combustibles y vehículos eléctricos de baja y alta capacidad. Matteo es ingeniero y cuenta con un doctorado de la Universidad de Cambridge en temas de energía y transporte. Del Carbono al Watt, un podcast del Departamento de Derecho, Minero, Energético de la Universidad Externado de Colombia, dedicado a informar, aportar y discutir la transición y la justicia energética en Colombia y el mundo.
Acompáñenos de la mano de nuestros invitados a aclarar ideas, conceptos y discusiones sobre el futuro de la minería, el petróleo, la energía y su relación con la transición y la justicia energética.
Soy Juan Felipe Neira.
Soy Luis Bustos y bienvenidos a la segunda temporada de El Carbono al Watt.
Traiga su libreta y comencemos. Bienvenidos a este nuevo episodio. Les agradecemos mucho su sintonía y queremos contarles que este es un episodio internacional, nuestro primer episodio en inglés, en el que conversaremos con Matteo Craglia, experto en transporte internacional y en transición energética.
Matteo, the first question will be, what's the role of transport on the energy transition?
Oh, it's a good question. Thank you, first of all, for having me on today. I guess so the role of the transport sector in the energy transition is really important. Why? Because the transport sector currently accounts for 23% of global energy-related CO2 emissions.
Okay.
So almost a quarter. So it's a really big and important sector producing a lot of greenhouse gas CO2 emissions that are currently causing climate change. And it's also the sector of the economy that is most dependent on fossil fuels. A very, very large proportion, over 90% of the energy used in the transport sector is fossil fuels. So we at the International Transport Forum are an international organization. As part of that, we look also quantitatively at seeing how countries are well placed and how globally we are managing the transition towards decarbonization in the transport sector. And our latest analyses find that the transport sector is currently not on track to decarbonize in line with the goals of the Paris Climate Agreement. So this also accounts for all of the ambitious policies and ambitions that have already been announced by governments around the world, and we're still not on track. And I guess transport in general provides a large number of essential services to our economies. It's not going away. We need transport. So it's really important to ensure that it can be as sustainable as possible. And this, I guess, the key to this is transitioning away from fossil fuels towards renewable sources of energy wherever possible, and reducing energy demands from the transport sector as well. So in particular, improving energy efficiencies and moving to more sustainable modes. So this, I guess, is what is the role of transport in the energy transition is particularly important, and we really need to start focusing.
Definitely, it's a really hard path.
It is a hard path to follow. But it's interesting because you mentioned the role of the transport sector in the economy and the connection with fossil fuels. But my question would be, therefore, there are different options to decarbonize the transport sector. Recently, on this podcast, we had the head of Porsche and Volkswagen for Colombia, and he was talking about the difference between sustainable mobility and electric mobility. How do you see that?
I think two of them are very closely related in that electric mobility is a very important component of sustainable mobility. But it's not the only. If we just converted all of our vehicles to electric vehicles. That would have a very significant impact on decarbonizing the sector. But we would still have a lot of congestion, a lot of issues with road safety. It wouldn't be able to solve all of the transport challenges and issues that we have in the transport sector. So we need to really have sustainable transport, sustainable mobility. We need to look at a wide package of different solutions, of which electromobility is one of them. But moving towards more sustainable modes of transport, promoting public transport where possible, active mobility are also very significant and important pillars that need to not be forgotten about within the transition as well. And I guess here it's important that this is something that we have to do all together, all countries, as well as governments and the private sector, all need to start moving towards sustainable mobility, because it's not that one stakeholder here is the one that really has to move the needle on decarbonization. We all need to pull together on it.
We need all the stakeholders here.
Yeah, absolutely. But if we need all the stakeholders, the question would be, in your opinion, which are the responsibilities of the private sector on the energy transition on the transport sector?
It's a good question. So I think perhaps to answer this question, it's also useful to highlight what is the role of governments. Governments have to set the regulatory framework, have to set what are the rules of the game of, I guess, point out that we have to decarbonize and set clear targets for the long term, and then also enforce those targets. That, I guess, is the role of governments. But then what is then the role of private companies within that? Is within that framework, it's the responsibility of private companies to meet those targets then in the most cost-effective, efficient way. The private sector has a duty to prioritize also the long-term sustainable business practices and not only look at short-term business interests and valuations. So I think also part of this is one big solution that I always recommend towards the private sector is to start aiming to measure the emissions that they produce. Already measuring their scope 1 emissions, scope 2 and emissions, scope 3 emissions as well. Everything that their company touches is really important and is really necessary, is measuring those emissions to be able to then have a foundation of how to develop solutions towards minimizing emissions. Here's really important to point out that the energy transition is in many cases going to be a really big economic opportunity. For example, renewable electricity already costs less than fossil fuels in many applications today. Electric vehicles in many cases already have a lower total cost of ownership, and understanding how to make use of some of these solutions is only possible if companies actually measure within their operations where the emissions actually coming from, to then start looking at what are the solutions. And companies also have to, I guess, to seize some of these opportunities. It's important for companies also to begin a bit of experimentation, doing some internal research and development and perhaps pilot projects to start preemptively gaining internal knowledge on the potential of new technologies. And also sort of to see that these are investments. So doing some research and development is an investment to then be able to seize the opportunities of green transition as well. The flip side is that it's also really important for private companies to understand the climate risks. As climate change starts to have greater and greater impacts, it's really important to see how the business practices of companies are at risk of some of the changes in transport, for example, not in transport, in climate change. Things like increased weather resilience, these types of aspects that are really going to have a significant impact on many businesses. And another important point is that moving forwards, access to capital and financial markets is going to become cheaper for companies that show that their business practices are sustainable. And so it's really important for companies to be aware of this and understand how they're placed themselves relative to leaders within their sector. And again, all of this is only really possible with the companies that start measuring weather emissions and benchmarking themselves compared to others. And really important to this is developing internal capacities within the company to start having strategies on these topics. start making sure that you have a team within your company that is actively looking at these topics. So as I say, look for the opportunities, but also the risks.
But I have a question there because I was wondering at ITF, you do see the transportation sector beginning with the transportation, the cars, the buses, the trucks, or you see the path, the climatic path, or even carbon path, beginning from the use of particular fuels. For example, you were mentioning that companies that benchmark themselves in a better way, or that they start changing business practices, for example, instead of using diesel, start using hydrogen. You think that's a part of the transportation transformation for climate change, or it's just an economic decision?
Exactly. I think for companies and more broadly across the economy, there are going to be different levers that can be pulled, and they will have different associated costs and impacts as well. So certain aspects, potentially as relatively small factors, things like trying to increase carpooling or increase your employees using public transport to get to work, without teleworking instead of going to a meeting far away. These are small aspects that can already make a meaningful difference and have relatively low costs. So I guess they're kind of low-hanging fruits. While as we move towards really trying to get to net zero and really deep decarbonization, that is really where we're going to need to have different types of fuels, different uptake of different technologies, which currently are slightly harder, slightly later within that hierarchy of different actions, but are nonetheless will be a key component to decarbonizing them. And if you want, I can go into a bit what are the roles of some of those different technologies.
Yes, that'd be wonderful.
Sure, I'm getting nod.
Yes, please.
So, sure, with pleasure. So you were mentioning things like electrification, hydrogen, and biofuels. I think understanding what the roles of these different technologies is first is really important to then help with devising a strategy of how to promote them, what is their relative importance. And here there's also then different aspects that countries are positioned differently within that transition. Countries around the world, there are differences obviously between emerging economies and developed economies. And the responses within each country to promoting these technologies will differ. So firstly, looking at the different technologies, from our perspective at ITF, we see that one of the most promising technologies is likely to be electrification, and it should be pursued wherever is commercially and technologically feasible. And we see that this is already underway. There's already electric vehicles have already seen record sales, and every single year they keep breaking those records again and again. And in the long term, electrification of transport is likely to be the most energy and cost-efficient route to decarbonizing vehicle fleets, and in particular, roads transport. For example, even with the average carbon intensity of electricity around the world, which includes still a fair amount of fossil fuels, electrification already represents a significant reduction in emissions. And that's only going to accelerate as we decarbonize electricity in the future. So we see electrification as being the most competitive option for the majority of road transport sectors, so including both light-duty passenger cars and motorcycles, but also, interestingly, within the heavy-duty vehicle segment as well. So at ITF, we started doing quite a bit of analysis on heavy-duty vehicles, and we see that the trajectory of improvements to batteries, cost reductions is really rapid, and this is likely to unlock more and more opportunities in sectors that were previously considered too difficult to electrify, in particular, heavy-duty vehicles. However, it's also important then to understand the limitations. So electrification will never play a significant role in decarbonizing aviation or long-distance shipping because of physics.
That it was really important when you mentioned the part of the long shipping, right, or the airplane underworld, they play in all this. It's really interesting, and that's a key point, that it's wonderful if you can go deep on that. That is not only for the electric cars, that it goes broader to airplanes, right, and to massive transportation.
Exactly. So we already see different technologies being most valuable in different sectors of the transport sector. So as mentioned, for road transport, surface-based modes, we see electrification playing the most significant role. But for aviation and shipping, which each of them accounts for 3% of emissions at the moment, so a total of 6%, that's, if you think about it, the entire emissions of a country like India, 7%. So it's a huge amount of emissions are just from aviation and shipping at the moment. And here, then we need to look at other technologies, other solutions. And this is where potentially biofuels, potentially hydrogen-based fuels can play a very important role. So for biofuels, we think that they can play an important role in decarbonization, but only if they're produced sustainably and don't lead to deforestation or land use change. And one challenge with biofuels is, globally at least, we see that their availability of sustainable biofuels is likely to be relatively limited, which means that we can't decarbonize the entire. What this means is that we're likely to need them for sectors that are particularly hard to electrify, such as aviation and shipping. And so long term, we should really aim to prioritize their use for these hard to decarbonize sectors. However, the challenge is, how do we get there? At the moment, it's quite expensive to start using biofuels within the shipping sector, within the aviation sector. So at the moment, we have to start looking into how can we scale up their production in the short term. And in countries, for example, in Latin America, which have already very significant biofuel production, we can already start scaling up this production sustainably, potentially using the existing demand in road vehicles. But it's really important to emphasize that we should try and use this as a transitory step. We're likely to need these for these hard to electrify sectors. And for that, we should also try and avoid locking in infrastructure investments into assets that risk becoming stranded assets as electrification of road transport takes off. So it's important to tactically also invest in the technologies of the future of fuel.
I have a question there, because we are looking into electrification, and there seems to be a high environmental cost in the medium to long term with electrification and the final disposition of batteries. So, the question is how technological obsolescence might hit us later on in this transformation.
Sure. So, these are very important questions that we all need to be considering. Our perspective is that electrification offers the most low-carbon sustainable route in the long term. Why? Already, electrification, as I mentioned before, already offers very significant emissions reductions globally, and that's only going to improve as we use more and more renewable electricity. Issues around the sustainability of batteries are definitely important. We definitely need to start considering them, but we also can't let perfection be the enemy of the good.
Absolutely.
We have a solution, and at the moment, for many sectors, electrification is the only solution that we can scale up sufficiently quickly to hit many of our decarbonization goals. As I said, it's not going to be able to solve everything.
Absolutely.
We need to try and make sure the batteries are produced as sustainably as possible. These are not.
Matteo, I just want to go back a little bit about the regulation that you mentioned. And in taking into consideration the different conditions and situations of countries, how can we promote different technological solutions, such as electricity, hydrogen, or even the biofuels on these undeveloping countries? How we can go to that?
So exactly. So countries are placed differently and obviously have different purchasing power for new shiny technologies such as electric vehicles and types of things. So we can't expect that everyone will be able to go at the same. That said, I think some of the rules of some of the technological limitations are based on physics, are likely to be global, and therefore, to a certain extent, the role of some of these technologies in the long term, globally, are likely to be pretty already set in stone. We know, for example, that electrification is going to be a very significant. We know that for aviation and shipping, we're going to need some energy density. So this, I guess, are important aspects that apply no matter if you're in a developed economy or in an emerging. That said, obviously, there are then differences between actual then specific countries. As you mentioned, for example, Brazil, which has very significant production of biofuels already. And in general, in Latin America more broadly, has very significant reserves of materials for battery production, a lot of potential for cheap renewable electricity. So in general, as a region, Latin America is very well placed to capitalize on many of these resources. But as mentioned, electric vehicles in Latin America still remain relatively expensive at the moment until some of those economies of scale start happening from the major producer countries of vehicles, particularly things like China, Europe, and North America. And until that happens, then price parity with conventional vehicles we see that's going to happen sometime this decade. And when that happens, that will really start to accelerate the adoption of certain technologies, and in particular electrification. But what I would say for many emerging economies is start with the low-hanging fruit as much as possible.
Okay.
So,
of course,
start trying to ensure that transport is as sustainable as possible. But in particular on the technological side, those low-hanging fruits are also things like electric 2- and 3-wheelers, and electric buses, which I know Colombia is already really seen as a leader in. And then from there, move up progressively, move then towards passenger cars, and then from there, things to trucks. Start from urban applications and then move to longer distance progressively. And here, things like procurement schemes are good. Publicly owned fleets are really good places to start. Building the charging infrastructure is really important to help unlock some of those low-hanging fruits. And more broadly, things like decarbonizing the electricity grid as quickly as possible. These are sort of some of the things that can already be done, even while many of the more future technologies are still quite expensive.
So, Matteo, what is your opinion on batteries as a solution for energy transition or aviation?
So, as we mentioned, so aviation in general requires travels long distances and therefore requires energy-dense fuels that emit lots of energy but don't weigh very much. If you think about a plane,
of course,
weight is a very important factor when you're trying to keep things up in the air.
Definitely.
And think about batteries, they don't have very high energy density. So they're quite heavy for how much energy you hold in them. That's not a problem for things that travel on the road, because weight is not such a big issue. But for aviation, it is. That means that, unfortunately, we're going to have to electrification is not going to play as much of a major role in aviation as many think. That's not said, though, that it can't have any impact. It definitely can, potentially up to a range of things like 300 kilometers. But it's very important to point out that is a very small share of the aviation sector's emissions.
And of course, we're waiting that the technological advance will help us on that, right? Because pretty much everything is about how much space they will get into the planes.
Even with sort of technological advancements, there's only so much that we can likely do in the next 30, 40 years in terms of technological advancements. There will definitely be advances in batteries, this we know. But we know that fundamentally, lithium-ion batteries will always be limited in terms of energy density, will always weigh a lot. And that constrains how far electric flights will be able to go, which then in turn constrains overall its emissions reductions. But that's not to say that we shouldn't do them. Everything will have its role to play. We just have to be realistic about the overall potential of decarbonization for each technology.
Absolutely. Matteo, it's just that I find very interesting the view of the ITF and particularly in your case on the road to electrification as a way to beginning to solve this problem. I was wondering if you guys have considered or studied the geopolitical impacts that electrification brings. What's your opinion on this?
It's also a very good question. So broadly, if we establish that we have to decarbonize, we have to try, if we are to limit the environmental impacts of climate change, we have to decarbonize as soon as possible. To do that, we have to choose the technologies that we have today, that we're already producing today in small numbers, that we can accelerate as soon as possible. That sort of limits the number of solutions that we have, and means that electrification is going to have to play a very significant role. And this, if you want to decarbonize, that is one of the major options that we have. Within that, though, we see that already there are very significant differences in how countries are placed. We see that China, for example, is incredibly well positioned in terms of the processing of the materials that are used to produce batteries, and also then in the various components and the actual in battery production. If I'm not mistaken, it's something around 2/3 of battery production globally at the moment is produced in China, which again, China has played a leading role. They've had sort of the foresight to see this as a huge opportunity for industrial development. And what we're now seeing is that other regions are now trying to catch up. Especially in developed economies, we've seen very significant policy packages of seeing the potential economic opportunities that electrification can have, and realizing that in many countries, they need to really start going very quickly to seize those opportunities. But yeah, this is definitely going to be a key area of new industry, and that is always then going to lead to a lot of competition, which again is not necessarily a bad thing. I mean, if it's competition, race to the top, if it helps to bring down costs, and in turn then helps to also decarbonize, that's a good thing. As mentioned, also in Latin America, is very well placed in terms of the resources, the lithium and some of the raw materials that can be used to produce batteries. I guess the key challenge for Latin America is how to get as much of the value added from those resources as well. How to sort of make most use of the economic opportunities that resource offers. I guess this is going to be one of the real key issues that we at the ITF are also keenly looking into.
From the viewpoint of ITF, from a global perspective and from getting to know different regulatory frameworks and government experiences, what do you think are the lessons that we need to take into consideration in Latin America and in Colombia for the energy transition on the transportation sector?
So I think firstly, I guess it's important to flag that Colombia is already on the right path. For example, as I mentioned before, is already seen as a leader in the uptake of things like electric buses. So it's important to acknowledge that as well. I think in general, for all governments, it's really important to have strategic thinking at the heart of government within the energy transition. This applies to all countries, but it's something that I think many governments still have to try and make sure that they're capitalizing on that as much as possible. So we know that the energy transition is going to impact all sectors of the economy. As mentioned before, it can offer very significant economic opportunities, but also equally significant risks. And therefore, it's really important to set up within governments and also within companies that strategic thinking, give the resources there. These are investments to be able to then make use of these opportunities when they come up. That really, it's all about capacity building and making sure that countries are well placed in that. Another part is also is engaging internationally to understand, for example, through the ITF, but also through other frameworks, is also understanding how other countries are faring, best practices, and what lessons are learned there. Another aspect, though, I think is very important, even for countries that are, I guess, at the beginning of the technological uptake, is making sure that there are the regulatory frameworks that are in place before any uptake of new technology. So, for example, making sure that this, I guess, is the unsexy stuff. It's making sure that technical standards and regulations are in place to allow the safe operation of vehicles and infrastructure. things like making sure the standards for electric chargers are already there. Unless that regulatory framework is there, it's going to be very challenging to have the uptake of technologies. And this takes time as well to develop. These are, I guess, is the bread and butter where to start. Other things are things like the regulatory frameworks on, again, I come back to charging infrastructure, but it's like defining the key responsibilities for different stakeholders in the market, the key requirements to follow when building infrastructure and obtaining a license to operate. These are really the important pieces of legislation that have to be passed up front that we see at the early stages of the transition. Then once that is in place, then governments can start thinking about setting the clear, ambitious and achievable targets for the uptake of different technologies. And here again, having the right types of policies in place to really stimulate that is really important. Things like fuel economy standards, potentially also standards on the import of second-hand vehicles, setting also binding targets for emissions reductions. These are really important pieces of policies that are really essential to actually stimulate the adoption of new technologies. Then once these things are in place, then potentially there's the role for perhaps limited economic incentives to actually manage that financial risk at the very start. This is something that we see a lot is where, how do you start? If there's no demand for new vehicles, for new fuels, how do you actually get started? And this is potentially where the government has a role to play in helping private sector companies manage that risk, potentially with some government guarantees or economic incentives. If you're interested in learning more about this, I would recommend our report called Cleaner Vehicles, which we did in 2021, which we try and talk about this a bit. But yeah, that I guess is how I would say.
It was so interesting to hear about second-hand vehicles. I want to know if you can go deep on that and tell us if you have some lessons about it or what you can say about it, because here in Colombia we got big issues about it.
We're seeing as an increasingly hot topic, and we're actually doing a research project on this topic this year, looking at currently understanding what are the flows of secondhand vehicles around the world, actually starting to document the numbers, where they come from, where they go. But then also in this project, we're also looking then at trying to forecast how that's going to change in the future. In particular with new technologies such as electric vehicles, how many of those might be exported as secondhand vehicles? In what condition might they be exported? Are they going to have any meaningful life at the end of it? And things then around batteries, what happens with them at the end of life as well. We see this as an important issue. A number of governments are already starting to put in place legislation on this. So in Europe, for example, there's a big piece of legislation called the End of Life Vehicle Directive that they're looking at and developing. But also from the perspective of secondhand importers, there are countries, for example, New Zealand is a good example, that imports a lot of secondhand vehicles from Japan mostly, have already now put in place legislation targeting specific requirements on the quality of, in this case, on electric vehicles as well, and on secondhand vehicles, to make sure that vehicles that are being imported into the country meet certain safety requirements, technical requirements. And we see that this is potentially something that's really important also for other emerging economies as well.
Y para que lo apunte en su libreta,
el recomendado de nuestro invitado es.
I would recommend, so firstly, our major reports that we have just published is the International Transport Forum Outlook 2023. So this is our flagship report in which we are looking at all government policies all around the world, all the latest technology developments, and seeing what does that mean for decarbonization. And one of the key points is that currently, again, we are not on track. But there is the potential we can achieve the goals of the Paris Agreement if only we continue to increase our ambition and continue to accelerate. And as I said, there's lots of opportunities to happen there. Then more broadly, other things that I would recommend on the energy transition for listeners, things like Michael Liebreich, his podcast, things like Catalyst by Shale Can, if you're interested about the energy transition. Another one is the Global Lithium podcast, which again might be interesting to many listeners. These are just, I guess, just off the cuff things that I would recommend, interesting ways to get insight.
Aquí termina Del Carbono al Watt.
Síguenos en Spreaker, Spotify y Apple Podcast.
También disponible en las redes del Departamento de Derecho, Minero, Energético de la Universidad Externado de Colombia. Del Carbono al Watt es un podcast original del Departamento de Derecho, Minero, Energético de la Universidad Externado de Colombia.
Producción general, Luis Bustos y Juan Felipe Neira.
Productor técnico, Ancísar Aponte y la Facultad de Comunicación Social de la Universidad Externado de Colombia.
Musicalización, Pixabay. Gracias por seguirnos.